In the world of ancient Greece, punishment was not always measured in death. For many women, the greatest fear was not the executioner's blade or the public spectacle of judgment, but a punishment designed to erase the self long before the body fell. Greek society built its order upon honor, lineage, and the preservation of household identity. To threaten any of these was to threaten a person's place in the world itself. Women, bound by customs older than the city-states, lived with the knowledge that certain transgressions, real or imagined, could condemn them to a fate where breath continued but life, as the Greeks understood it, did not. This unwritten punishment appeared in poems, court records, and private letters. It was referenced by philosophers who rarely spoke of women directly, hinted at by lawmakers who understood its power, and feared in whispered stories passed through generations. It operated quietly, without soldiers or torturers, yet no instrument of iron caused greater trembling. For women of Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and the islands scattered across the Aegean, its arrival meant the end of one's name, one's ties, and one's position in the eyes of family and gods. To many, this fate was truly worse than death. Her story began in Athens, in the year 432 BCE, during the tense summers that marked the early rumblings of the Peloponnesian War. The city was restless, watchful, and quick to judge. Rumors moved through the agora with the same ease as merchants calling prices, and the magistrates, pressured by public suspicion, sharpened their attention on even the smallest disputes. It was in this atmosphere that a woman named Thaleia found herself standing before the Archon's stone platform, waiting for a verdict she had never imagined would concern her. She had not committed theft, nor harmed another, nor broken any written law of the polis. Yet the accusation against her carried the weight of dishonor severe enough to summon a council of citizens. Her husband, a potter named Melisandros, claimed she had acted against the sanctity of the household. In Athens, the oikos was not simply a home, it was a miniature state whose order mirrored the city's. A woman could be judged for altering its balance, even unintentionally. A whispered argument overheard by a neighbor, a disagreement about dowry property, or a moment of defiance in the presence of a male relative could all be transformed, under certain conditions, into grounds for formal examination. Thaleia, who had spent most of her life within the quiet rooms of their home near the foothills of the Acropolis, could not understand how her private quarrel had reached the ears of officials. But by the time she stood before the magistrate, the matter had become something else entirely. Witnesses spoke, not about the argument itself, but about what it represented. An elderly neighbor mentioned that she had seen Thaleia walking alone beyond the designated streets for women. Another testified that she had raised her voice in the marketplace, an action some men considered improper. None of these observations were crimes, yet together they formed a portrait of a woman stepping outside the boundaries the city believed necessary for its order. The magistrate, Lykinos, listened with the calm patience of a man accustomed to disputes involving land, trade, and inheritance. His duty was not to punish, but to determine whether her behavior posed a threat to the household's cohesion. It was this question, rather than any direct offense, that shaped the city's approach to women. By the end of the hearing, the matter seemed to grow larger than Thaleia's own situation. The council murmured about examples from older cases, some dated as far back as Solon's reforms in the early 6th century BCE. They cited the expectations placed upon Athenian wives, daughters, and widows' roles, preserved through generations and reinforced by law, custom, and ritual practice. When the sentence was finally spoken, it was not delivered with force or dramatic display. Lykinos simply announced that Thaleia would undergo a punishment known to the city, but rarely described in detail: social erasure of the household. In Athens, it was a sentence feared more deeply than execution, because execution ended only the body. This punishment ended one's place in the world. It meant removal from the household registry, the curious circle of women, and the rituals that allowed one to be acknowledged by both the living and the gods. It was a quiet severing of ties, a stripping away of identity that left a woman alive, but without a recognized existence in the eyes of her own community. Thaleia felt the words settle over her like a shroud. No chains were placed on her wrists. No guards escorted her away, yet she understood the weight of the decision. Execution, though severe, was clean and final, ending suffering in an instant. This punishment stretched across a lifetime. A woman condemned in this manner could not attend family rites, could not participate in household festivals, could not inherit, could not claim protection from relatives, and in some cases, could not even speak on behalf of her children. She became present, yet invisible. Melisandros did not look at her as the room dispersed. In Athens, husbands held authority, but even he had not expected the magistrate to choose this path. Once the sentence was given, there was nothing more to argue. The city recognized her in law only long enough to remove her from its records. After that, she would be considered no one. Her name would no longer appear in the oikos register kept by her husband. She would leave the home not as a widow or exile, but as something without definition, a state the Greeks believed was more terrifying than death, because it denied both memory and meaning. That evening, as she walked through the familiar streets, past the pottery stalls and the quiet houses lit by oil lamps, she felt the city's gaze shift. People who once exchanged greetings now looked through her. Children who had played near her doorway paused and stepped aside. She was alive, yet Athens had already begun to forget her. And so, the punishment that ancient women feared more than execution began not with violence, but with silence, a silence heavy enough to erase a life. The morning after the sentence, the city felt unchanged, yet every familiar corner of Athens now carried a different weight for Thalia. The sun rose above the marble edges of the Acropolis, casting its pale light across the narrow streets. But where she once walked with quiet certainty, she now moved like a shadow displaced from its source. She passed the fountain house where women gathered each dawn to draw water, their conversations weaving together fragments of household concerns and seasonal rites. Today, as she approached with her empty jug, the group fell silent. They did not speak harshly to her. They simply stepped aside in a subtle but unmistakable gesture, an acknowledgement not of her presence, but of her exclusion. She filled her jug, yet the emptiness in her chest grew deeper than the hollow vessel she carried. The punishment she faced was not enforced by guards or decrees. It lived instead in the spaces between people, in the breath of conversation that no longer reached her, in the rituals of daily life that had quietly closed their gates. Before the sentence, she had been part of the unseen network that sustained the city. Women trading household tips, offering herbs for fevers, whispering prayers during childbirth, preparing offerings for the household gods. Now, none of these simple acts belonged to her. To participate would imply a legitimacy she no longer held. She had not been exiled from the land, but she had been exiled from meaning. By midday, she returned to the house that was no longer hers. The door stood open, as it always had during the warmer months, but the threshold felt altered. In Athens, a woman's place was defined by the home, by its order, its labor, its quiet rhythm. Yet as she stepped inside, she sensed the boundaries of her world shifting. Melisandros stood beside the storeroom, hands resting on the wooden frame, his expression unreadable. He did not yell. He did not condemn her. Instead, he spoke with the detached tone of someone sorting through objects rather than memories. He informed her that she must leave before nightfall. The household, he said, could not maintain a presence that no longer existed in the eyes of the city. His words were logical, even gentle, but they delivered a final cut sharper than any blade. Without the oikos, a woman lost not only shelter but identity. The city recognized citizens through their households, and households through their lineage and rituals. A woman detached from this structure became something undefined. She could not return to her father's home, for Athens saw marriage as a transfer of guardianship. To go backward was to disrupt the order of things. She could not remain with relatives, for their homes were bound by the same expectations of social legitimacy, and she could not remain in her own home, because the punishment demanded that she vanish from its register. Thalia gathered the few belongings she was permitted to take, a small woolen cloak, a pair of sandals, and a clay lamp she had kept since girlhood. Each item seemed to hold a part of her former life, yet their weight felt unfamiliar in her hands. She stepped outside just as the sun dipped lower, the streets glowing with the soft gold of late afternoon. Athens bustled as it always did, merchants calling out prices, children chasing one another near the Stoa, elders debating under shaded colonnades, but none of it belonged to her anymore. The city that had nurtured her since childhood now treated her as one of the invisible. The first night of her unmaking came quickly. She walked toward the outskirts, where the houses thinned and the land opened into gentle fields. In these quieter spaces, away from the watchful eyes of the city, she paused to breathe. The air felt different, cooler, freer, yet threaded with uncertainty. She remembered stories told by older women about punishments that did not kill the body, but hollowed the spirit. Stories of wives who displeased their families, daughters who stepped beyond expected boundaries, or widows whose choices were deemed improper. Each tale spoke of a fate similar to hers, a stripping away of identity that left the woman untethered, drifting between worlds of belonging and oblivion. As night settled, she found a place to sit beneath an olive tree, its trunk twisted upward like an ancient gesture, offering shade and a sense of shelter. She lit her small clay lamp, its flame trembling against the soft breeze. In the quiet glow, she tried to understand the punishment more fully. It was not simply the removal of her name from a register. It was the removal of her presence from the rhythm of the polis. A woman could live without wealth, without possessions, even without family, but without recognition. She slipped beyond the fabric that bound the community together. Yet as she sat beneath the tree, she realized something the magistrates had not considered. Silence could erase, but silence could also reshape. A woman stripped of place might still find space beyond the edges of the city's expectations. The punishment intended to diminish her might instead reveal paths unseen by those who enforced it. The thought arrived quietly, not as defiance but as possibility. Her life as she had known it was gone, yet she remained. Breath still filled her lungs. Memory still shaped her thoughts. The world had declared her invisible, but invisibility, she began to realize, did not mean absence. It meant that the next step she took would be her own, unmeasured by the household she had lost, or the city that had forgotten her. And so, as the night deepened, Thaleia wrapped her cloak around her shoulders, held her small lamp close, and waited for the dawn that would mark the beginning of whatever remained. At dawn, Thaleia awoke beneath the olive tree, stiff from the cold but steady in her resolve. The early light crept across the fields in thin bands, touching the scattered stones, the trodden soil, and the road that led back into Athens. From where she sat, she could see faint outlines of the city walls, bronze-tipped and pale in the morning sun. She did not move toward them. The gates, though open to all who entered for trade or petition, were closed to her in ways no guard needed to enforce. What she now carried was an absence, and the polis did not open its arms to those who had been carefully removed from its order. Still, she walked a short distance toward the path, drawn by instinct rather than intention. The road to Athens was already alive with movement. Farmers from the outskirts traveled inward with baskets of figs, onions, and small jars of honey. A group of young boys almost headed toward the training grounds for exercises arranged by their instructors. A pair of priests in long robes walked with solemn steps, discussing preparations for an upcoming festival honoring Athena Polias. Each passerby carried a sense of belonging that Thaleia felt now as a distant echo. When she reached the edge of the path, a shepherd paused to greet her, unaware of the sentence that hovered over her. She returned the greeting softly, but as soon as he noticed her lack of household markings, no bracelets, no hair ribbon in the color of her household, no attendant, his expression changed, not unkindly, but with caution. He stepped aside, offering her the path with a respectful distance, as though she embodied a quiet misfortune he dared not invite into conversation. He did not speak again before continuing on his way. It was the first moment of recognition she had received since the sentence, yet it arrived in the form of withdrawal rather than welcome. Thaleia turned away from the city and began walking along a small footpath that led toward the hills beyond the farmland. She carried no clear plan, only the knowledge that she could not return to the familiar spaces of her past life. Athens had not banished her by decree, but the weight of social erasure made remaining within its boundaries impossible. To stay would mean enduring daily reminders of her undoing, the silent avoidance of neighbors, the closing of doors, the absence of faces once familiar. The city had not taken her breath, but it had taken her place among the breathing. By mid-morning, she reached a rise overlooking a quiet valley. Small streams cut through the land, their faint, shimmering, weaving patterns across the soil. In the distance, she could see the outlines of farms worked by families who had tilled the land for generations. None of them would know her story. None of them would see her as anything but a stranger passing by. The anonymity offered a fragile comfort, though it did little to ease the ache of displacement. She sat beside one of the small streams, dipping her hands into the cool water. The flow was steady, gentle, free of the judgment she had felt in the city. Water accepted without question. It reflected only what stood before it. As she watched the ripples shift around her fingers, she thought of the council's final words, spoken in the hall where magistrates weighed disputes long before this season's unrest. They had said her actions threatened household harmony. They had spoken of order, of the sanctity of the oikos, and of the expectations placed upon women to maintain the city's structure. Yet in their decision, they had overlooked something essential. A woman stripped of place does not cease to exist. She becomes unbound. For the first time since the sentence, Thalia allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the borders of Athens, a life shaped by choices rather than laws. She had spent her years confined to a narrow understanding of duty, believing that her worth came from fulfilling roles determined at birth. Now, those roles had been removed, not by rebellion but by decree. Strangely, the absence created space. She wondered what could fill it. As she walked farther into the valley, she came upon a small cluster of travelers resting beside a grove of pines. They were not Athenians, she could tell by their clothing and the melodic cadence of their speech. They greeted her with open curiosity, asking if she sought the next town to the north or the coastal paths that led to the fishing villages. Their questions did not probe her origins, nor did they carry assumptions shaped by the weight of a household registry. They simply saw her as a woman alone on a journey. For a moment, Thalia hesitated. She could not speak of Athens, nor of the sentence, nor of the life she had just lost. These travelers lived outside the framework that had defined her existence. She offered a small smile and simply said she was heading north. The group welcomed her to join them for part of the path, offering bread and figs in a gesture of companionship. It was the first act of kindness she had felt since the punishment was spoken. As they walked together, the land opened before her, in gentle slopes and distant horizons. Each step carried her farther from the city that had crafted her identity and then erased it. She felt the faint stirrings of possibility, not yet formed into purpose but present nonetheless. The punishment intended to diminish her had instead pushed her toward a threshold she had never imagined crossing. When she parted ways with the travelers near the northern fork, she stood alone once more. Yet the solitude felt different now. It was not the enforced isolation of the city's judgment. It was the quiet beginning of something unclaimed, something she would shape with her own hands. Ahead lay lands untouched by the laws that had unmade her. Behind lay the city that believed it had the power to define her existence. She turned her steps toward the path that offered no certainty, only the freedom of the unknown. And for the first time since the sentence, the weight on her chest eased, not because her past had faded, but because her future had begun. The path that stretched before her wound through quiet slopes, lined with low shrubs and clusters of pale stones warmed by the day's rising heat. Thalia followed it without the guidance of plan or destination, letting the soft crunch of earth beneath her sandals mark her progress. The landscape, empty of names and boundaries, welcomed her with a simplicity she had never known. Each step carried her farther from expectations that had once defined every moment of her life. The absence of the city's watchful structure did not erase the uncertainty within her, but it allowed her to breathe without fear of being observed, measured, or judged. The sky above was wide and open, a smooth expanse without the shadow of walls or rooftops. Thalia found herself looking upward more often than she had in years. In the city, The sky appeared in narrow slices between buildings, its brightness filtered through the angle of architecture. Out here, it rested upon the land like an endless invitation. The path curved along gentle ridges, revealing rolling stretches of earth shaped by wind and seasons, rather than the order of human hands. There were no markers to guide her, no familiar structures to suggest direction. Instead, the land offered quiet space, urging her forward with its silence. She walked until midday, pausing only when her legs demanded rest. A cluster of rocks provided a shaded seat beneath the thin shadow of a solitary tree. From here, she could see the faint line of the road she had left behind, now distant and nearly swallowed by the horizon. She felt no pull to return. The place she had known as home did not hold her anymore. What lay ahead remained undefined, but the undefined did not frighten her. Its vastness carried a different weight from the confinement she had endured. When she resumed her journey, the landscape shifted gently. The shrubs grew taller, scattered among patches of dry grass. A narrow stream crossed her path, its water clear and slow-moving. She knelt beside it, letting the coolness wash over her hands. The stream's steady movement soothed her in ways she had not anticipated. It seemed to carry with it an understanding of change, of leaving one place and finding another without need for explanation. The water flowed without allegiance, without restrictions. Its path was shaped only by the contours of the land. Thaleia cupped her hands, lifting the water to her face. The chill startled her senses, grounding her in the present. She realized then how heavily memory had pressed upon her since leaving the city. Each recollection of judgment, each echo of silence, clung to her like dust. The simple act of cold water breaking across her skin reminded her that she was more than the verdict placed upon her. She was a body moving through space, capable of choosing where her feet would carry her next. As she continued forward, she noticed signs of small life along the path. A pair of birds darted between bushes, their movements quick and seamless. A hare, startled by her footsteps, bounded across the trail before disappearing into tall grass. These creatures lived without concern for the structures of human society. Their presence brought her a quiet sense of companionship, as though the land itself acknowledged her existence in ways the city no longer did. Toward late afternoon, the path descended into a shallow valley. The air grew warmer, carrying the faint scent of earth recently touched by sun. Thaleia slowed her pace, observing the delicate interplay of light and shadow across the land. This valley, unclaimed by any dwelling or boundary, felt open in a way the world rarely offered. She sensed in its quiet vastness a reflection of her own state, empty of expectation, yet full of potential. She found a spot near a cluster of stones where she could rest for the evening. The stones formed a natural circle, offering shelter from the wind. She placed her cloak upon the ground and settled into the gentle hollow, her lamp beside her. As evening approached, the sky deepened into layers of muted color. She watched the slow descent of the sun, appreciating the unhurried pace of its disappearance. There were no tasks binding her to routine, no voices calling her, no rituals demanding her presence. The silence around her was not a deprivation, it was freedom. Night emerged slowly, accompanied by the soft chorus of insects. Thaleia lit her lamp, its small flame steady despite the stirring breeze. She sat with her thoughts, no longer resisting their weight. The memory of the sentence still lingered, a reminder etched into the edges of her being. Yet it did not tighten around her as it once had. The land had given her distance, enough to see the sentence not as an ending, but as a separation, a splitting between who she had been taught to be and who she might now become. She thought of the roles she had carried: wife, daughter, member of a household, roles shaped by tradition, responsibility, and the expectations placed upon women. Those roles had defined her place in the city, but had not reached the core of her existence. Now, without them, she began to sense a self beneath the layers, quiet, steady, and newly visible to her own understanding. The punishment intended to strip her of identity was revealing an identity the city had never acknowledged. The stars emerged above, scattered across the darkening sky. Thaleia lay back upon her cloak, letting the earth support her. The night air wrapped around her, cool and vast. She felt the weight of the world lift slightly as she gazed upward. For the first time in many years, She allowed herself to imagine a future, not shaped by the boundaries of others. This path of the unseen, though uncertain, belonged to her alone. And in the solitude of that realization, she found the faint beginnings of peace. The following days unfolded without urgency, each one stretching across the land in a rhythm unlike anything Thalia had known before. In the city, time moved according to tasks, morning rituals, midday labor, evening duties. Here, the hours drifted with the shifting of light, rather than the expectations of others. She walked when her body felt ready to walk, rested when the wind cooled the air, and listened to the quiet landscape as though it were speaking a language without words. The shift from structure to freedom came slowly, and though she had no destination, she found herself settling into the natural pulse of the world around her. The land she traveled through held no markers to indicate ownership or boundary. Gentle hills rose and fell in long curves, dotted with wild grasses that swayed in the breeze. The path under her feet became less defined, dissolving into open stretches of earth, interrupted only by occasional clusters of shrubs or the faint lines carved by passing animals. With each step, she felt the city's weight loosening, as though every mile softened the imprint of judgment upon her. She rose each morning with the sun, letting its early light warm her skin before she began to walk. The morning air carried a calm coolness, carrying scents of dew-touched grass and distant soil. As she moved through the quiet world, the land reminded her of something she had forgotten. Life beyond walls did not measure worth through reputation or household position. Out here, she simply existed, breathing, observing, continuing. It was enough. By midday, she often found a place to rest beneath a tree or beside a small ridge. The wind brought shifting patterns of sound, rustling leaves, distant calls of unseen animals, the gentle hum of insects moving through the grass. These sounds formed a quiet company, steady and undemanding. In the city, silence had been a punishment. Here it was a companion, a soft presence she was learning to trust. One afternoon, she reached a shallow rise overlooking a wide plain that stretched toward the horizon. The view opened before her in a slow, unfolding vastness. She felt the wind brush across her arms, carrying with it the faint warmth of the season. Standing at the crest of the rise, she allowed herself a long breath, one that filled her lungs fully and cleanly. She realized she had not taken such a breath in years. The air of the city had always carried tension dust from the streets, echoes of arguments, unspoken judgments. Here the air felt new. She walked along the edge of the plain, her steps measured but unhurried. As the day deepened, shadows lengthened across the land, forming soft shapes that clung to the edges of the earth. She found a small patch of grass and sat down, letting her legs rest. The warmth of the sun lingered on her skin, and for a moment she closed her eyes, feeling the world around her without needing to see it. In these quiet days, her thoughts often returned to the life she had left behind, but the memories no longer bore the heavy ache they once carried. Instead, they drifted like faint outlines, recognizable, yet softened by distance. She remembered the familiar rooms she once tended, the quiet moments of early morning, the sound of pots being placed upon the hearth. She remembered herself moving through those spaces, guided by routines she had accepted without question. Now, those images felt almost like scenes from another person's life. As evening approached, she gathered small pieces of wood to build a modest fire. The flame rose slowly, casting its gentle glow upon the ground. The warmth eased the chill of twilight, and she drew her cloak closer around her shoulders. She watched the fire burn, its movements steady and alive. There was something comforting in the way the flames danced, simple, mesmerizing, self-contained. It asked nothing from her. The night sky stretched open above her, dotted with faint points of light. She lifted her gaze to the stars, recognizing none of them, yet feeling an odd sense of connection to their presence. They were distant, unreachable, yet constant. In their quiet way, they reminded her that existence did not rely on being seen or acknowledged by others. Even without recognition, a life could still continue. As she lay upon the ground, letting sleep slowly approach, she felt no fear of the darkness. The night air wrapped around her gently, carrying with it the soft whisper of wind moving through the grass. The world did not demand explanations from her. It simply offered space. The days that followed carried this same rhythm. She walked, rested, listened, and observed. Each day carried small variations, a change in the angle of the sun, a new path formed by animals, the sudden appearance of distant clouds. These shifts created a sense of time without pressure. She learned to move with the world rather than against it. In the city, she had lived in constant awareness of rules, expectations, and judgment. Out here, she discovered another truth. Life could exist without the structures that once shaped her every action. The land did not ask her to define herself. It did not question her place. It allowed her to be. On one quiet evening, as she sat watching another fading sunset, she realized that her days had begun to form a gentle continuity. One day led into the next with a soft flow, unbroken by fear or command. The punishment intended to diminish her had instead created a space where she began to rediscover the simple act of being. She wrapped her cloak around her body, feeling the warmth of the dying sun across her face. In this season of quiet days, she found not the end of a life, but the beginning of a different one, unclaimed, unstructured, and entirely her own. Solitude settled around her like a second cloak, neither heavy nor light, but familiar in a way she had never expected. Days stretched in soft succession, each one shaped only by the landscape and her own quiet choices. She rose with the sun, moved through the still air, and rested where the land offered shade. The absence of voices created a space where her thoughts could unfold without interruption. She began to understand the subtle distinction between being alone and being abandoned. Alone, she discovered parts of herself that had never spoken loudly enough to be heard beneath the weight of expectation. The land she crossed was gentle, its contours flowing like long-held breath. She followed no strict path, letting her steps drift toward places that drew her eye. Sometimes it was a line of low hills that seemed to lean into the horizon. Other times it was the faint shimmer of water, reflecting sky. She discovered small streams hidden between folds of earth, their movement soft and unhurried. When she knelt beside them, she felt the cool water run over her fingers, grounding her in the present moment. These streams became familiar companions, quiet presences that asked nothing of her. Each evening, she found a place to rest, where the ground felt stable beneath her. She learned to arrange stones into a simple shelter that shielded her from wind. She gathered wood with a practiced eye, selecting pieces that would burn steadily through the night. The fire she built each evening became a center of warmth, a silent witness to her thoughts. In the shifting glow, she watched shadows dance across the earth, their movements soft and unthreatening. The nights belonged to stillness, and she let the calm settle deep within her chest. As she moved farther from the regions she once recognized, the world opened wider. Hills gave way to plains, plains to shallow valleys, valleys to gentle ridges. She walked through each without urgency, allowing the landscape to shape her pace. The earth beneath her feet varied in texture, sometimes firm, sometimes soft, sometimes scattered with pebbles that shifted underfoot. She learned to listen to the subtle language of the land, the way the grass whispered under wind, the way distant insects hummed in the heat, the way birds circled above with unhurried grace. Solitude brought clarity. She began to notice patterns she had overlooked in her former life, the rhythm of her breath, the weight of her steps, the sensations of hunger and rest, without the constraints of scheduled routine. She learned to read the sky for signs of weather, thin clouds that promised cool mornings, thick clusters that hinted at rain. She found herself speaking aloud at times, not from loneliness, but from a desire to hear her own voice in the open air. The sound echoed softly, carried by the breeze until it dissolved into distance. On certain days, she paused to gather what the land provided. Wild fruits grew in small clusters along rocky soil. Herbs with faint, calming scents sprouted near streams. She learned which plants offered nourishment and which carried bitterness. These simple tasks brought her a sense of capability she had never known while living within walls. In the city, her labor had been guided by duty. Here, it was guided by need. She found this distinction strangely liberating. One afternoon, she came upon a wide, flat expanse of earth where the wind swept freely across the land. She stood at its center, feeling the air move around her like invisible currents. Her cloak fluttered behind her, the fabric carrying the scent of sun and soil. She closed her eyes and let the wind pass through her, feeling its coolness along her neck and arms. In that moment, solitude did not feel empty. It felt expansive, a vast inner space where she could breathe without constraint. There were moments, of course, when memory tugged at her. Images from her past rose unexpectedly, the sound of footsteps in narrow streets, the glow of lamps in familiar rooms, the quiet clatter of pottery. But these memories no longer tightened her breath as they once had. They drifted lightly, touching her mind and then fading again. They were pieces of a life that had ended, yet they no longer defined her. In solitude, she began to understand that loss did not always hollow a person. Sometimes it carved space for something new. As days turned slowly to weeks, she noticed changes within herself. Her steps became steadier, her senses more attuned to the world around her. She slept more deeply, waking refreshed by the cool touch of morning. She no longer waited for the anxiety that once lingered behind every thought. The fear that had accompanied her departure from the city had dissipated, replaced by a calm acceptance of her new reality. She had not sought solitude, yet solitude had revealed its own quiet strength. One evening, as she sat beside a small fire, she lifted a handful of soil from the ground. It felt warm from the day's sun, soft and grainy in her palm. She let it slip slowly through her fingers, watching as it fell back to the earth. The gesture felt symbolic, though she could not name why. It was as though she were releasing something, an old sense of self, perhaps, or the weight of judgment that had once bound her. The earth accepted it without question. The night grew darker, the sky stretching wide above her. She lay back upon her cloak and gazed at the stars. They appeared brighter here, unsoftened by the lights of dwellings or the smoke of hearths. Their quiet brilliance lingered in her vision, steady and serene. In their glow, she felt a subtle shift within herself. The shape of her solitude had become something familiar, something she could inhabit without fear. The world had taken her name, her place, her belonging, but it had given her this, a space where she could breathe, think, and simply exist, free of the structures that once defined her. Solitude, she realized, was no longer a punishment. It was a path, and she was learning how to walk it. Silence followed her with the steadiness of a loyal companion. It existed not as an absence, but as a presence, shaping her days with a quiet rhythm. In the city, silence had been something rare, interrupted by footsteps, commands, the clatter of jars, and the muted voices behind doors. Here, silence took on a different form. It did not watch her. It did not judge. It did not require a response. It simply moved with her, unbending and constant. In the early mornings, she walked through pale light that softened the edges of the land. The air carried a faint chill, enough to remind her of the night, but not enough to stir discomfort. With each step, she felt the silence press gently around her, neither harsh nor empty. It shaped her awareness, sharpening her senses to the subtle details of her surroundings. Leaves shifting along the ground, wind brushing over grass, distant birds stirring with the dawn. These small sounds emerged more clearly against the quiet, forming a soft pattern that guided her forward. As she walked, she became more aware of her own movements, the sound of her steps, the pace of her breath, the slight rustle of her clothing. These noises, once irrelevant, now grounded her. She listened to them the way one listens to a familiar story, recognizing each detail with growing clarity. Silence framed these sounds, allowing her to hear herself in ways she never had. During the day, she often stopped to rest beneath broad stretches of sky. She sat on flat stones warmed by sunlight, letting the quiet seep into her thoughts. Nothing demanded her attention. No voice intruded. She could think without expectation, and her thoughts flowed like water, sometimes drifting, sometimes deepening. What had once been a burden now felt like a gentle unfolding within her mind. At times, the silence felt heavy, as though pressing upon the edges of her memories. Moments from her past rose in fragments, glances exchanged behind curtained halls, the weight of tasks she once performed, the murmurs of conversations never meant for her ears. But these memories no longer stirred the sharp sting they once held. Instead, they emerged like distant shadows softened by time and distance. The silence allowed her to examine them without flinching. She let them rise and fade, giving them no more weight than they deserved. When evening approached, the silence deepened. She watched as light receded slowly across the land, stretching long shadows toward her. She built her fire with practiced movements, listening to the small crackle of wood catching flame. The fire's glow cast a faint circle around her, yet beyond it, the world remained still. She felt herself suspended between warmth and darkness, each one shaping the silence in different ways. Night carried its own kind of quiet. In the absence of day's breezes and birdsong, she could hear the slow, steady pulse of her own heartbeat. It matched the rhythm of the earth beneath her, steady and grounding. She lay on her cloak and watched the sky, where stars shimmered with a cold, distant light. The silence of night stretched vast and unbroken, larger than anything she had known within walls. It demanded nothing, it simply existed. There were moments when silence revealed more than sound ever had. She discovered truths about herself that had never surfaced while she served others. She learned that fear did not vanish when noise disappeared. Rather, it softened, losing its sharp edges. She felt emotions unfold without haste: sorrow, relief, lingering uncertainty, quiet hope. None overwhelmed her. Silence held them gently, allowing each to settle in its own time. She also learned to speak through silence, though not with words. Her actions carried meaning: the way she gathered wood, the way she arranged stones, the way she traced patterns in the soil with her fingertips. These gestures reflected her thoughts, forming a language that belonged only to her. She realized she did not need to be seen or heard to exist fully. Silence had granted her a space where she could define herself without interference. As days passed, she began to sense a shift. Silence no longer felt like a barrier separating her from the world she had left. Instead, it felt like a bridge, something that connected her to the land, to her own breath, to a rhythm more ancient than any she had known. She understood that silence had shaped countless lives before hers, that people had walked through landscapes like this long before her, wrapped in the same stillness. The thought comforted her. It made her feel less alone. On one particular evening, she sat by her fire and listened to the soft crackling of embers. She held a small stone in her hand, smooth and cool. Turning it over slowly, she felt the subtle ridges worn into its surface. The silence around her deepened until the world seemed to pause. In that moment, she realized something simple yet profound. Silence did not erase her past. It transformed it. What had once been imposed upon her had shifted into something she could carry on her own terms. Her past no longer defined her steps. Silence did. As the night darkened, she lay beneath the stars and let the stillness settle once more. The weight of silence was no longer heavy. It was steady, an anchor, a guide, a constant companion in a world that had no need for walls or boundaries. And she understood that, as long as she walked this path, silence would walk with her. The land shifted gradually beneath her steps, rising into slopes shaped by long-forgotten forces. As she moved forward, she noticed the first sign of change. Stones set in a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be natural. They lay half-buried beneath soil and grass, their edges worn but their alignment unmistakable. She paused, letting her eyes follow the faint line they formed. It stretched toward a ridge, its purpose quiet yet persistent, as if guiding her without demanding to be seen. When she reached the ridge, she found more stones larger, arranged in a low formation that resembled the remains of an old boundary. Time had softened their shape, but the intent behind them remained. They formed a silent division between one stretch of land and another, not as a wall of force, but as a reminder that people once stood here, marking what mattered to them. She touched the top of one stone, feeling its cool, rough surface. It did not speak of ownership or rule. It spoke of memory. Beyond the stones, the landscape opened into a broad, sloping field. Grass moved in slow waves as wind passed through, making the entire ground appear to breathe. She stepped across the boundary, and felt a shift not physical, but internal. It was as though crossing that line placed her in a space untouched by the voices she once heard. Nothing here carried the imprint of command or judgment. The field stretched wide and patient, offering her a quiet that felt deeper than the silence she had known before. As she walked, she noticed how the wind changed. It no longer brushed against her in passing currents. Instead, it moved steadily, flowing along the field like a constant presence. It shaped the grass, swaying it in long, even strokes that formed patterns across the land. She watched how the blades tilted and rose, each movement blending into the next. The wind spoke through motion alone, its voice soft but continuous. It asked nothing. It simply moved around her, reminding her that boundaries could exist without confinement. She continued toward the far edge of the field, where scattered stones formed another line. These stones differed from the first. They were flatter, wider, arranged in a curve that suggested separation without finality. She sensed that whoever placed them had done so with care rather than force. This boundary was not meant to keep anything in or out. It was meant to mark a transition, a shift from one type of land to another, from open field to sheltered ground. Beyond the curved stones stood a cluster of trees. Their trunks rose straight and tall, their bark darkened by years of weather. The canopy above formed a calm, dim light, filtering the sky into soft gray-green tones. As she stepped beneath the branches, she felt the temperature change. The air cooled slightly, and the steady wind faded into faint breaths of movement. Here, sound held a different character. Leaves rustled not in waves, but in small, rhythmic pulses, like quiet beats of a distant heart. She followed a narrow path marked by fallen leaves. Each step brought her deeper into the stillness of the grove. The trees formed gentle lines around her, each one standing in silent recognition of the others. She sensed no threat here, no hidden eyes, no judgment. The grove carried the calm assurance of a place that existed long before her arrival and would continue long after. Its silence felt older than the boundaries she had crossed, older than the steps she took, older even than the memories she carried. At the center of the grove, she found a single stone set upright. It rose slightly higher than her waist, smooth on one side and rough on the other. Time had shaped its surface, softening some edges while sharpening others. She placed her hand on the smooth side and felt a faint warmth lingering from the sun that had touched it earlier. The stone did not tell a story. It did not offer meaning. Yet standing before it, she felt a quiet acceptance settle around her. For a moment, she closed her eyes. The grove breathed gently, its leaves shifting in a soft cadence that matched her own breaths. The boundary she had crossed now felt distant, though not forgotten. It had marked a point in her journey, one she now realized had less to do with land and more to do with the slow reordering of her thoughts. Each step beyond that boundary carried her further from the life she knew, not because she sought distance, but because the land itself asked her to see differently. When she opened her eyes, she looked up at the canopy. Light filtered through in small, shifting fragments, creating patterns on the ground. The patterns changed with each movement of the leaves, never repeating, never settling into sameness. She found comfort in their unpredictability. They reminded her that change could be steady without being harsh, gradual without being forced. As she prepared to leave the grove, she stepped carefully along the path, mindful of how her feet touched the earth. Each step felt quieter than the last, as though the land itself softened her movements. She emerged from the trees and crossed back over the curved stones. The field greeted her with its open expanse, the wind resuming its long, even strokes. When she crossed the first boundary again, she paused. The stones did not seem imposing. They did not divide her past from her present. They simply marked the places she had moved through, silent witnesses to steps taken, choices made, and quiet shifts within her. She realized that boundaries did not always confine. Some simply helped her understand where she had been. She continued walking, the land stretching ahead in calm, unbroken quiet. The stones faded behind her, yet their presence remained, not as walls, but as gentle markers on a path unfolding without urgency. She reached the edge of a shallow stream, just as the light began to soften across the land. It was not wide, nor fast, nor deep. It moved at a steady pace, carrying thin ribbons of light along its surface. The water flowed with a calm persistence, shaping its own path through smooth stones and pale sand. The moment she approached, the sound it made shifted a low, continuous murmur that seemed to rise and fall with her breath. She knelt beside it, placing her hand above the surface without touching it. The water reflected her shadow in a distorted shape. Small ripples drifted outward from drifting leaves, bending the pattern until it no longer resembled anything familiar. She watched how the surface changed with every movement, never still, always adjusting. Nothing resisted the flow. Everything reshaped itself around it. A thin branch drifted toward her, carried by the current. It rolled over a stone, caught for a moment, then continued onward when the water pressed it forward. She followed it with her eyes, until it disappeared behind a bend. The quiet persistence of the stream felt different from the stillness she had encountered before. This was movement without haste, direction without force. It reminded her that even gentle things could endure. She touched the surface lightly with her fingertips. Cold spread across her skin in a slow, deliberate bloom. She kept her hand still, feeling how the current shaped itself around each finger, splitting and rejoining in small patterns. The water did not resist her presence. It simply carried on, adjusting with subtle shifts. She sensed no urgency in it, no demand, only continuation. On the opposite bank, reeds swayed with the same patient rhythm. Their thin stalks leaned forward as the wind brushed past them, returning to their upright posture once the breeze passed. The shadows they cast on the water stretched into long, pale lines that trembled with each ripple. The stream accepted those shadows without holding them, letting them break apart and reform in quiet cycles. As she stood, she noticed a group of stones rising just above the waterline. Their surfaces were smooth, shaped by years of contact with flowing water. Each stone displayed a different shade: gray, muted brown, a faint tint of red. They sat close together yet distinct, forming a natural path that crossed the stream in short steps. She moved toward them, testing the stability of the first stone with a gentle press of her foot. The stone held firm, though a thin layer of water washed over its surface. She stepped onto it, feeling the coolness through the soles of her feet. From this position, she could see the stream from above. The water moved beneath her in layered currents, slow near the banks, quicker near the center, spiraling gently where stones disrupted its path. She shifted her weight and stepped onto the next stone. Each stone brought a new angle of view. Some stood slightly higher, letting her see further upstream. Others dipped lower, bringing her closer to the surface where small whirls of water formed around corners. The final stone rested near the opposite bank, half covered by reeds. She stepped onto it and paused, letting the scene settle around her. On this side, the land changed again. The ground rose in a gradual slope, covered with patches of soft moss that spread between scattered roots. The air felt cooler here, carrying the scent of the stream mixed with the faint trace of wet earth. She placed her hand against a nearby root, its surface firm and textured, shaped by years of quiet growth. The root extended toward the stream, anchoring itself with patient strength. She followed the slope upward, listening to the shift in sound as the stream grew quieter behind her. Each step softened its persistent murmur until it became a faint pattern beneath the rustle of leaves. High on the slope, she found a small hollow in the ground where water collected from recent rain. The pool lay undisturbed, bordered by stones and moss. Unlike the stream, it did not move. Its surface reflected the sky with almost perfect clarity. She leaned closer, studying the reflection. The pale colors above formed soft shapes on the still water. A leaf drifted down from a nearby branch, landing on the surface with a gentle tap. Rings spread outward in expanding circles, reshaping the reflection into smooth distortions. She waited until the surface stilled again, watching how the water returned naturally to calm. The contrast between the stream she had crossed and the still pool before her drew her attention. One carried movement forward with steady purpose. The other held moments in quiet suspension. Both existed within the same landscape, shaped by the same forces, yet each expressed a different form of endurance. She realized that motion and stillness could coexist without conflict, each offering something the other could not. A small insect skated across the surface of the pool, its legs barely breaking the tension. It left a temporary pattern behind it, arches and lines that lingered for a breath before fading. The insect changed direction abruptly, creating new shapes as it moved. Nothing in the pool resisted it. The water accepted each disturbance, then smoothed itself back into silence. She touched the surface lightly, just as she had with the stream. Here the cold felt softer, less immediate. The pool vibrated gently beneath her touch, sending ripples toward the edges. When she withdrew her hand, the circles continued outward until they dissolved into stillness once more. She watched the final ripple settle, leaving the water clear again. As she stood, she let her eyes trace the path she had taken the stones across the stream, the slope rising into the quiet hollow, the broken boundary of sunlight above. Each part of the landscape had offered something subtle: movement, resistance, acceptance, reflection. Together they formed a sequence that shaped her without speaking a single word. She stepped back toward the slope, letting gravity pull her down in a slow, controlled descent. The sound of the stream grew louder with each step, returning in its steady, familiar rhythm. When she reached the bank again, she paused. The water continued its quiet journey, unchanged by her crossing. She watched it for a moment longer, letting its persistence settle in her thoughts. Then she turned away, moving forward along the land that stretched before her, the quiet murmur of the stream fading behind her as she walked. The land ahead opened into a broad clearing where the wind rarely reached. The air held a muted heaviness, as if every movement slowed the moment it began. She stepped into the space with careful strides, sensing the difference at once. Sounds that should have carried her breath. The faint brush of her foot against the ground seemed to linger close to her instead of drifting outward. Nothing hurried here. The ground was firm beneath her feet, covered in a thin layer of pale dust that rose in soft clouds with each step. The dust settled slowly, drifting in delicate patterns before fading into the stillness. There were no reeds or moving water here, no shifting branches, only faint impressions of earlier steps, animal or human. She could not tell, traced across the clearing. They crossed in quiet lines, none pressing deeply enough to reveal weight or urgency. She walked along one of the faint trails, noting how each footprint ahead blurred at the edges. The dust erased detail but preserved direction. It recorded presence without identity. She paused at one of the clearer impressions, kneeling to examine it. The outline curved in a shallow arc before tapering at the heel. A single stone lay near its edge, small enough to have been stepped on without notice. She brushed it aside gently. When she stood again, her own footprint marked the place where she had paused. The dust wrapped around its edges, softening it almost immediately. She watched the subtle change, the way the land accepted the mark without resistance. No wind came to disturb it. No movement pressed against it. It simply shifted by its own slow pace. As she walked farther into the clearing, the air seemed to thicken around her. Her breath moved against it like a gentle force, meeting invisible resistance. The sky above appeared muted, its light softened by a thin veil that did not come from clouds. The sun's glow spread evenly across the space, casting no sharp shadows. The absence of contrast made the land appear suspended outside of time. Near the center of the clearing stood a cluster of stones arranged in a loose, natural circle. None were tall. Most barely reached her knees. Yet their placement hinted at a pattern, shaped not by chance but by repetition perhaps, by many hands over long stretches of time. The stone surfaces were smooth, marked by faint lines that ran across them like fractures healed long ago. She entered the circle without hesitation. The moment she crossed its boundary, the air grew even more still. Her breath sounded louder. The faint movement of her clothing felt exaggerated. She placed her hand on one of the stones. Its surface was cool, though the air around her carried the warmth of the day. Thin cracks traced the stone's surface, not deep enough to break it, but long enough to show age. She followed the lines with her fingertips, feeling the direction of each one. Inside the circle, the dust did not rise as easily. The ground rested flat, undisturbed. as if protected from the outside air. Her footsteps left only faint impressions, quickly softening. The clearing's stillness reached deeper here, settling over the space with a quiet steadiness. She sensed no memory within the stones, no purpose she could decipher, only a sustained stillness held between them. A faint hum drifted across the clearing as she stood at its center. It was not a sound but a sensation, a subtle vibration in the air, steady and low. She looked around for a source, but found none. The stones did not tremble, the dust did not shift. The air remained still, yet something passed through the space, a movement too slight to be seen but clear enough to be felt. She stepped slowly around the inside of the circle, watching how the light changed with each movement. The muted glow formed soft gradients across the stone surfaces, deepening in the cracks and brightening along the edges. Her own shadow formed a faint shape behind her, drifting slightly as she moved. It never sharpened, never darkened, as if the space refused to hold anything sharply defined. On the far side of the circle, she found a stone slightly taller than the others. Its surface bore a small indentation, no larger than the palm of her hand. She touched it and felt the faintest trace of warmth. The warmth did not match the air around her, or the rest of the stones. It seemed to come from the stone itself, as though it had held sunlight longer than the others. She lifted her hand and placed it there again to confirm. The warmth remained. She knelt, studying the ground at the base of the stone. A shallow depression curved outward, forming a half circle in the dust. It might once have held water or collected something carried by the wind, though none of that remained. The depression had the same muted edges as the footprints she had seen earlier. Time softened everything here. She placed both hands on the taller stone and closed her eyes. The weight of the air pressed against her with gentle persistence. Nothing moved, yet she sensed a quiet fullness in the space. The hum she had felt earlier seemed to settle into a single note, long and steady. It did not rise or fall. It simply existed, shaping the emptiness without breaking it. She stepped back from the stone and stood at the center of the circle once more. The hum faded into stillness again. The clearing remained unchanged. Nothing acknowledged her presence, yet nothing pushed her away. The space absorbed movement without reacting to it. When she left the circle, she noticed the shift immediately. The stillness behind her remained enclosed within the stones, while the broader clearing allowed sound to return in faint layers, her foot brushing against dust, the soft rustle of fabric, the quiet rhythm of her breathing. Even these small sounds felt louder after the silence. She crossed the clearing slowly, leaving a sequence of footprints behind her. Each one softened within seconds, swallowed by dust and still air. When she reached the edge, she turned once more to look back. The stones stood unchanged. The clearing rested in the same muted quiet. Nothing marked her passage. She stepped beyond the boundary, back into the land where wind could move and shadows could shift. The stillness of the clearing settled into her thoughts like a faint imprint, soft, steady, and unbroken. She carried it with her as she moved onward, letting the weight of still air fade gradually behind her. The path ahead narrowed into a long corridor of earth, where the ground appeared smooth enough to read as untouched. She slowed her steps, expecting the dust to rise or settle as it had in other places. But here the surface remained level, unbroken, as though it refused to record the weight of anything that passed across it. She placed her foot down lightly, then more firmly, and watched as the impression appeared only for a moment before lifting itself back into place. The ground behaved less like soil and more like a surface remembering its original shape. She knelt to test it with her hand. Her fingers moved across the surface without resistance. The earth felt neither soft nor compacted. It simply yielded, and then rose again, holding no sign that she had touched it. She drew a small line in the dirt with the tip of her finger. The line held its shape for a heartbeat, and then slowly rose until the surface smoothed back into uniform stillness. Nothing she placed there lasted longer than a breath. She continued walking, watching the faint marks made by her steps dissolve behind her. The corridor stretched forward in a straight, unwavering line, its edges defined by low ridges that looked like the remains of old boundaries. These ridges held more texture than the path itself, showing cracks, chips, and small pockets where seeds or gravel had once collected. But the central passage refused all such detail. It remained clean and empty, untouched by time or movement. The air inside the corridor carried a quiet resonance. Even small sounds seemed to echo more gently than they should. When she inhaled, her breath filled the space with a subtle tone that faded slowly, stretched out, as though the air refused to hurry its release. Her footsteps, light as they were, created a muted pulse that drifted forward in steady intervals. Nothing scattered or interrupted these sounds. They simply came and went, leaving no trace behind. She paused halfway through the corridor to look back. The path behind her appeared untouched, smooth as if no one had crossed it. Even knowing she had walked there moments before, she could not distinguish any mark of her passage. Her footprints had vanished completely. The corridor held no memory. She placed her hand against one of the ridges along the side. Its surface felt worn, shaped by years of wind or shifting weather. Tiny scratches marked the stone-like texture, and small grains flaked off at her touch. She pressed her hand to the ridge more firmly, confirming its solidity. The ridge held history in every uneven surface, but the path within the corridor held none. The contrast unsettled her. A place that preserved nothing suggested either protection or erasure. Though she sensed no resistance in the space, it simply refused to change. She wondered whether anyone else had walked this corridor before her. If they had, there was no sign of them. The passage allowed movement but not presence. Further ahead, the corridor widened slightly, revealing a shallow basin in the center. Unlike the rest of the path, this basin held a faint depression that did not rise when she approached. The mark settled into the earth as though shaped by something that had stayed longer than a single step. She knelt beside it, studying the shape. It resembled neither a footprint nor the curve of a tool. The edges formed a wide oval, smooth and shallow. She touched the basin. The earth inside felt firmer than the surrounding path. Pressing gently, she felt the surface remain steady, not lifting as the rest of the corridor did. Something had rested here long enough to leave an impression that resisted erasure. She brushed away a thin layer of dust from its edges. The oval shape grew clearer but offered no further detail. She stood and stepped into the basin. The earth did not rise to erase her footprint this time. Instead, it shifted slightly beneath her weight, holding her presence for a moment before settling back into the same shallow shape. She lifted her foot and stepped out onto the corridor again. The impression she left inside the basin did not change the overall shape. It absorbed her step without altering itself. She walked around the basin slowly, tracing its outline with her eyes. The oval shape seemed deliberate, though its purpose remained hidden. Whatever had created it remained unknown. Yet it had stayed long enough to press itself into the land in a way that resisted time. The corridor forgot everything except this one mark. As she stepped back into the main path, the ground resumed its smooth, self-restoring behavior. Her footprints lingered for only moments before disappearing. She moved forward with slower steps now, watching how each contact between her foot and the earth erased itself. The land behaved with precision, as though following a rule that allowed nothing transient to remain. The corridor continued until it reached a narrow arch of earth, formed by two leaning ridges. The passage beneath the arch looked no different from the path she had already crossed, but the air felt subtly cooler as she approached. She stepped beneath the arch and waited to see whether the path behind her would change. It did not. It remained smooth, uninterrupted. She placed her hand against the inside of the arch. The surface felt cold enough to send a faint shiver through her fingers. The texture was rough, different from the ground beneath her feet. Small grooves marked places where something had once scraped against the ridge, leaving shallow cuts. Unlike the corridor floor, these grooves held their shape. She leaned forward to examine the underside of the arch. A faint layer of dust clung there. When she brushed it lightly, the dust fell away in a small cloud, drifting downward before settling on the corridor floor. The moment the dust landed, the earth smoothed itself again, erasing the places where it fell. She watched this silent correction with steady curiosity. The corridor wanted to remain perfect. Every disturbance dissolved. The basin alone held form. She stepped beyond the arch and allowed her steps to fall naturally once more. The surface rose and settled in its now familiar rhythm. At the far end of the corridor, the ridge walls opened into a wider area where wind touched the land again. The first brush of moving air reached her face in a cool breath. She turned to look back one last time. The corridor stretched straight and silent behind her, unmarked and unchanged, showing no sign that she had walked its length. She stepped forward into the open land, leaving the corridor and its absence of memory behind her. The air grew lighter, sounds returned, and the ground behaved as Earth normally did. But she carried with her the sense of a place where traces did not hold, a place that allowed passage without acknowledgement, a place shaped by silence rather than time. Beyond the place where wind returned, the land opened into a wide field with a surface unlike any she had crossed so far. It appeared patterned not by human hands but by the slow work of time. Thin, parallel lines stretched across the ground in long, straight paths, evenly spaced yet not perfectly identical. Some lines dipped slightly while others rose with the faintest curve, as though shaped by countless small pressures applied over long intervals. The field felt deliberate in structure but untouched by tools. She took a careful step onto the patterned surface. The ground held firm beneath her, offering resistance that felt different from the soft dust or smooth corridor. The lines did not shift when she crossed them. Instead, each step produced a sound no louder than a small thud, muted but steady. The field accepted her presence without altering itself or erasing the mark of her weight. Nothing smoothed itself here. Nothing resisted change. It simply held. She paused to study the pattern more closely. Each line was formed of compacted earth, slightly darker than the spaces between. When she pressed her foot against one, it felt solid, as though shaped by repeated pressure. The raised strips between the lines felt softer. She knelt to run her fingers along the difference. The solid lines stayed firm beneath her touch. The softer spaces crumbled slightly, though not enough to collapse. It reminded her of a path worn by countless travelers who walked the same direction again and again, except no footprints, no signs of scraping, no evidence of individuals remained. Only the measure of many steps layered over time. As she walked farther into the field, she noticed how the lines changed subtly in direction. At first they ran straight, but then they bent in a broad arc that curved across the field. The curve was gentle, almost imperceptible, until she followed it for several paces. She turned and looked back along her path. The lines she had crossed did not shift or blur. They remained solid, their direction clear. The curve led toward a slight rise in the terrain. From a distance, the rise looked insignificant, but as she approached it, she noticed how the lines converged at a single point on its slope. The convergence did not appear forced. It happened gradually, as though shaped by the movement of something that passed this way repeatedly. Each line found its way into a single narrow channel that led up the rise. She bent beside the channel and touched its surface. It was the firmest ground she had felt so far, hard, compacted, almost polished. The surface carried faint marks from long use, but not enough to reveal meaning or shape. Whatever created the channel had moved consistently, always following the same path. She placed her foot in the channel. It fit naturally, its depth neither too shallow nor too deep. She walked a few steps within it, noticing how the channel directed her path without force. It guided her with steady certainty. The rise felt smooth beneath her feet, as though hundreds of steps had worn away any irregularity. At the top of the rise, the pattern of lines dispersed and formed a wide open space shaped like a shallow bowl. The edges of the bowl sloped gently upward, forming a boundary that seemed neither natural nor entirely shaped by purpose. The ground inside the bowl was smoother than the field, but not erased like the corridor. It held faint impressions, soft depressions where the lines had ended and spread outward like ripples. She stood at the center of the bowl and listened. The air held a quiet resonance, similar to the stillness in earlier places but lighter, as though this space allowed sound to drift a little farther. When she exhaled, the sound traveled outward in a soft expansion, fading only after reaching the edges of the bowl. The ground beneath her felt warm compared to the surrounding land. She knelt and pressed her palm to the surface. The warmth did not come from the sun. It held an even temperature that did not match the air around her. She lifted her hand and placed it down in another spot. The warmth remained, steady and uniform. She traced the faint depressions with her fingertips. The ripples formed gentle arcs, radiating from the center of the bowl outward. Each arc grew fainter farther from the center, as though shaped by something that had emanated from this very point repeatedly. She rose and began walking along the outer edge of the bowl. The ground there was cooler, the texture slightly rougher. Small stones had collected along the edges, suggesting that wind occasionally reached this place, though the center remained untouched. She noticed how the slope of the bowl created a natural boundary. Movement toward the center came easily. Movement outward required more effort. She wondered how many times the same path had been taken here, how many steps had crossed the field, followed the arc, entered the channel, and reached this bowl. The land held no record of individuals, only patterns. The steps did not remain, yet the structure they created endured. Returning to the center, she stood still and allowed her thoughts to settle. The field, with its layered traces, held a different kind of presence than the corridor or the clearing. It did not erase or silence. Instead, it accumulated movement, shaping itself through repetition without revealing the identities of those who moved across it. She closed her eyes for a moment. The air shifted around her with a faint rhythmic pulse, barely perceptible but steady enough to feel. It resembled the pattern of measured steps she had followed, soft, consistent, unbroken. Whether the pulse came from the land or from within her, she could not tell. When she opened her eyes again, the bowl looked unchanged. Nothing stirred. The field behind her remained patterned in its quiet arcs. She walked slowly toward the opposite edge of the bowl, where a narrow break in the rise formed an opening into the land beyond. As she stepped through it, the warmth beneath her feet faded. The lines from the field did not continue. The land ahead stretched wide and featureless, waiting without pattern or memory. She crossed into it with calm certainty, letting the echoes of measured steps settle behind her. The land ahead opened into a flat expanse where the ground carried a soft, muted color that changed only when the light moved across it. Nothing else shaped the space, no ridges, no stones, no trails. The surface held an even texture, neither smooth nor rough, offering the same faint resistance no matter where she stepped. It accepted movement without sound, allowing her feet to pass across it with only the slightest whisper from fabric or breath. As she walked, she noticed how the light behaved differently here. The sun's glow touched the ground in long, pale bands that stretched across the surface and shifted with the slow arc of the sky. The bands did not brighten or dim dramatically. Instead, they slid with steady motion, creating quiet gradients rather than sharp contrasts. When she moved into one of the bands, the tone of the ground beneath her appeared to change by a shade, though her footsteps made no mark. She paused and watched the nearest band of light. It moved so slowly that she could not see its progress. Yet when she looked away and back again, it occupied a different place. The movement held no urgency. It glided across the land with a patience that felt older than anything she had seen before. She walked through several bands, noticing how each one shifted temperature slightly. Some held warmth, as though touched directly by the sun. Others felt cooler, as if the light had passed through a subtle veil before reaching the ground. The variations were gentle, barely noticeable unless she stood still long enough to sense them. She let her hands drift at her sides, feeling the air pass lightly over her palms. The expanse carried no echo. When she inhaled, the sound faded immediately, absorbed into the openness. Her footsteps disappeared into the ground with no lingering rhythm. The world around her felt wide and quiet, shaped by an atmosphere that moved only when the light did. She slowed her steps until she walked with steady, deliberate movements. The silence here felt different from the silence of the corridor or the clearing. It was less a lack of sound and more a state of calm presence, as though the land itself rested in a long, unbroken pause. Her breath joined that pause with each exhale, folding naturally into the stillness. In the distance ahead, a faint shimmer appeared, neither a structure nor an object, but a change in the air. It rose like heat from stone, wavering gently, though the ground beneath her remained cool. The shimmer did not distort the land around it. It only marked a place where the light moved differently, bending in soft curves before returning to its usual path. She approached the shimmer with quiet curiosity. The air thickened slightly as she neared it, forming a resistance so subtle she felt it more than she saw it. When she stepped closer, the shimmer spread outward in a wide arc, rippling across the expanse like the surface of water touched by a feather. She extended her hand toward it. The air grew warmer near her fingertips, though nothing stirred. The shimmer responded in small, delicate waves that drifted away from her hand before dissolving. She stepped into the center of the phenomenon, letting it envelop her. The warmth settled across her skin in a gentle layer, neither rising nor fading. It remained steady, as though acknowledging her presence without altering itself. Standing inside the shimmer, she looked down at the ground. The muted color here deepened slightly, forming a tone richer than the rest of the expanse. The ground did not bend or shift under her weight. It held firm, unchanged, unaffected by the movement of the light. Yet the shimmer created a soft boundary around her, marking a space that felt distinct without being separate. She knelt and placed her palm flat against the ground. The warmth from the shimmer spread through her hand in a slow, even pulse. It reminded her of the warmth she had felt inside the bowl on the rise, though this warmth carried no memory. It simply existed, resting lightly beneath the surface. A faint hum drifted through the air, not a sound, but a sensation, gentle and sustained. It seemed to originate from the shimmer itself. The hum moved through her body with the same steady pattern as her breath, matching the rhythm without forcing it. She remained there for a moment, allowing the quiet resonance to settle. When the hum faded, she stood and stepped out of the shimmer. The air cooled slightly as she left its boundary, returning to the stillness of the open expanse. She turned to look back, expecting the shimmer to remain, but it dissolved into the air, leaving the land as uniform as before. She walked forward again, this time with a slower pace, watching how the bands of light shifted around her. The movement of the light took on a subtle pattern. Each band drifted toward the place where the shimmer had appeared, as though drawn to that point by a quiet force. When the light passed across the space she had just left, it brightened momentarily before resuming its steady tone. The change lasted only a breath. As she continued across the expanse, she noticed how her presence interacted with the land, not by leaving marks, but by altering the movement of light. Each step created a faint ripple that spread outward and then vanished as soon as she moved on. The ripples did not disturb the ground. They only changed the path of the light for a moment. She experimented by stepping deliberately into one of the bands. The light bent around her foot, forming a soft curve before straightening again. She lifted her foot and placed it beside the band. The curve vanished. The light returned to its path. She walked farther until the bands of light began to thin, stretching into longer and more delicate strands. The ground beneath them grew lighter in tone, approaching a pale shade that almost matched the sky. The transition happened gradually, as though the expanse were shifting toward a softer state. At the far edge of the expanse, a gentle slope rose from the ground. Its surface held the same muted tone but appeared more solid, as if shaped by a foundation beneath. She approached the slope and placed her hand upon it. The texture felt firmer, less influenced by the movement of light. She began to climb, letting the slope guide her upward in a steady incline. When she reached the top, she looked back over the expanse. The light moved across it in long, slow waves, bending and straightening with the same calm rhythm she had felt earlier. The shimmer did not return, but she sensed its presence in the lingering warmth on her skin. She turned and stepped down the far side of the slope, leaving behind the field of moving light. The land ahead waited in soft silence, ready to shift into its next form. The slope descended into a shallow valley, where the air held a faint, continuous vibration, as if distant movement traveled beneath the ground rather than above it. The valley stretched in a long curve, its floor covered in a layer of fine soil that responded to sound in unusual ways. When she stepped forward, her foot sank slightly, and the softest echo rose from below, not sharp, not delayed, but a muted response that matched the weight of her step before fading instantly. She paused, listening. The valley did not repeat the echo. It gave only what was asked of it, nothing more. She placed her other foot down with equal care, and again, the muted echo rose from the ground. The sound did not travel outward. It stayed close, wrapped around the moment of contact. She walked a few paces, observing how each step produced a unique echo, shaped by the angle of her foot and the pressure she applied. The valley walls were low and gentle, lined with smooth sediment that held no vegetation. The material looked layered, as though formed by slow settling over vast stretches of time. Each layer held a slightly different color: pale beige, muted gray, faint gold, yet none broke sharply from the others. The layers blended with the same quiet tone that filled the air. As she continued walking, she noticed how her breathing interacted with the valley floor. When she exhaled, the ground produced a faint, shimmering response, like a breath returning to her in a softer, deeper form. She inhaled again and listened. The air moved through her lungs with the same muted resonance carried by the valley, as though the space shaped the sound that entered her. She knelt to touch the soil. It felt cool and loose at the surface, but deeper layers held compact firmness. She pressed her hand down, and a soft echo rose beneath her palm. The sound traveled no farther than her wrist. Even as she lifted her hand, the echo dissipated in a moment. The valley held no memory of contact. It responded and released instantly, neither erasing nor preserving, simply moving with the action. She stood and turned toward the nearest valley wall. When she walked closer, the echoes changed. Instead of rising from the floor, they developed faint harmonies, thin layers of sound created when her footsteps drew near the sediment layers. Each step produced multiple tones, soft and delicate, overlapping in brief unity before dissolving into silence. She placed her hand against the wall. The texture felt smooth at the surface but carried ridges beneath, like the memory of pressure long past. She tapped the wall lightly with her fingertips. The echo rose from within the layers, returning in a faint, airy whisper that matched the pattern of her tapping but softened each sound. When she paused, the valley fell silent again. Stepping back, she observed how even small movements changed the valley's responses. When she turned her head, the shift of air around her ear produced a subtle wave against the ground. When she brushed her sleeve, a soft tone flickered beneath her feet. Every action created a response, yet none lingered. The valley did not store echoes, it shaped them. The further she walked, the more the echo changed. It grew warmer in tone, as though the soil held greater depth in some parts of the valley. She followed the warm-toned echoes until she reached a shallow depression. The soil here was darker, denser. When she stepped into the depression, the ground produced a deeper, richer resonance. The sound filled the small basin before fading with gentle precision. She remained in the depression for a moment, listening to how her breathing interacted with the deeper resonance. Each exhale created a tone that curved outward, shaping itself against the shallow walls before vanishing. When she stepped out of the basin, the resonance shifted back to the valley's lighter tone. She walked along the valley floor until she reached a place where the walls pulled closer together. The space narrowed into a passage that guided sound more deliberately. When she entered, the echo strengthened. Each footstep produced a clearer, more defined response. The sound moved ahead of her, then returned in thin ripples. The ripples pressed gently against her legs before dissolving. Inside the passage, the air felt slightly warmer. The warmth carried through the sound, giving the echoes a subtle fullness. She touched the wall again. This time, the echo returned with a soft resonance that felt almost circular, as though sound moved in a loop before releasing. Near the end of the passage, the valley widened again, forming a second bowl-like space. The echoes here behaved differently. Instead of matching her steps precisely, they spread outward in gentle waves that traveled across the bowl's surface. The waves moved slowly, barely visible except in the faint shift of dust as they passed. When the waves reached the edge of the bowl, they faded without returning. She walked to the center of the bowl and knelt to observe the dust. It moved only when sound touched it, responding with delicate ripples. She placed her hand flat on the ground and exhaled softly. The dust quivered in a circular pattern, expanding outward before settling again. Even her quietest movements created these patterns, The bowl responded to everything but captured nothing. As she stood and looked around, she realized the valley formed a space where movement and silence balanced perfectly, neither overpowering the other. The echoes did not clutter the air. They drifted, shaped their patterns, then released themselves. Nothing held, nothing accumulated. She walked toward the far end of the valley, where the walls lowered gradually until they blended with the surrounding land. The echo faded as she approached the boundary. Her last step within the valley produced only a faint pulse before dissolving. The moment she crossed its edge, sound returned to its ordinary form, traveling without shaping the ground. She turned once more to look at the valley floor behind her. The space rested in its quiet rhythm, ready to echo the next step that entered it and forget the moment the step passed. She continued forward, carrying the valley's soft resonance within her, a sense of movement that left no trace, shaped only by the balance of presence and release. At the far end of the plain, where the fading halos of light no longer rose beneath her feet, the land began to slope downward into a place where stillness gathered in long, even layers. She descended slowly, sensing the change before she reached it. The air no longer moved with the faint warmth of the plain or the soft resonance of the valley. It settled into a quiet so complete that each breath felt suspended, held in a space that neither pressed nor opened. The ground beneath her shifted from its pale uniformity into a muted, darker shade, as though the earth collected the remnants of quiet moments and drew them inward. The slope ended at a wide terrace, where the surface looked untouched but not smooth, covered instead with fine granules that lay in delicate arrangements she could not fully read. Each cluster formed a subtle pattern, neither random nor deliberate. The granules shifted only when she moved close, responding with the slightest tremor as if acknowledging her presence. When she stepped onto the surface, the granules tightened beneath her feet and then relaxed again. They did not follow her movements. They returned to their own order the moment she passed. She walked across the terrace until she reached its center, where a subtle depression formed a boundary that could barely be seen but felt clearly underfoot. The moment she crossed it, the granules ceased their tremor. The air around her grew denser, though no wind or sound carried through it. The silence here felt different, not empty, but full, as though shaped by countless moments of stillness held together in one unbroken space. Ahead, a long, narrow structure rose from the ground. It was not a building or a wall, but a ridge formed of tightly packed earth, tall enough to stand above her shoulders. Its surface carried faint striations that ran horizontally, each line even and subtle. When she approached the ridge and placed her hand upon it, the texture felt neither rough nor smooth. It held a firmness that required no explanation, simply the natural state of something that had rested in place for longer than she could imagine. She traced her fingers along the striations. They did not shift beneath her touch. They remained part of the structure, unmoving. When she stepped back, she noticed that the ridge extended in both directions farther than she could see. Its presence divided the landscape into two silent halves. At the base of the ridge, a narrow passage dipped beneath it, a low opening barely tall enough for her to enter. She knelt and studied the space. The ground beneath the opening carried the same granules she had felt earlier, but here they arranged themselves in small spirals, each one turning inward in delicate patterns. She reached out and touched a spiral. The granules shifted slightly, then returned to their shape with gentle precision. She bent and stepped into the passage, moving slowly to avoid touching the ridge above her. The ceiling hovered just inches above her head. The silence deepened as she walked, settling around her with a quiet weight. The passage curved in a gentle arc, guiding her through the ridge rather than beneath it. The curve created a sense of movement without disorientation. She followed it until the ceiling began to rise again. When she stepped out on the other side, the land opened into a vast, level expanse unlike anything she had yet seen. The ground was perfectly smooth, holding no texture, no granules, no marks. The surface reflected a faint glow not from the sun but from the land itself, as though light emerged from within rather than above. Her reflection did not appear. The ground accepted brightness but not form. She placed her foot upon it, The surface did not give. It did not tremble or respond with sound. It held her weight without reaction. When she took another step, the ground behaved the same. Her movement created no ripple of light, no echo, no haze. The space absorbed everything, offering no signs of acknowledgement. She walked farther across the expanse, listening for even the faintest change in sound or texture. But the silence remained perfect. It did not grow heavier or lighter. It simply existed in a steady, continuous state. Her breath softened. Her steps slowed. She felt herself settling into the rhythm of the space, shaped not by movement but by its absence. At the very center of the expanse, she noticed a slight rise so faint it could only be detected by the smallest change in pressure beneath her feet. She approached it carefully. The rise formed a single smooth mound no taller than her knee. Its surface held the same faint glow as the rest of the expanse. But when she placed her hand upon it, she felt warmth radiating gently from within. The warmth spread across her palm, matching the quiet pulse of her breath. She closed her eyes and let her hand rest there. The warmth did not increase or fade. It remained constant, as though the mound carried a core of steady energy untouched by time. The silence around her deepened further, not by becoming heavier but by becoming complete. She lifted her hand and stepped onto the mound. The surface supported her without shifting. She stood at its center and looked across the expanse. There were no boundaries, no structures, no patterns. Only light rising from the ground and silence settling across the horizon. In that moment, she understood the nature of the place. It was not meant to record movement, sound, shadow, or shape. It was the threshold where all traces ceased, not erased, but allowed to release themselves. Here, silence did not come from absence. It came from completion. She stepped down from the mound and walked toward the far horizon. The expanse remained unchanged behind her, holding no memory of her passage. The ridge, the valley, the plain all existed somewhere beyond, but their echoes did not reach this space. She felt no weight from the journey she had taken. She carried only the quiet certainty that nothing here required her presence to continue. As she crossed the last stretch of the expanse, the light beneath her feet grew gradually softer until it blended with the horizon itself. She walked forward until the ground and sky met in a seamless, quiet boundary. And then she stepped beyond it.